The knock on the door wasn't loud, but it was final. It was the kind of sound a man hears when everything he's built is about to change, though he don't know it yet. Samuel Dory had heard plenty of knocks. Bankmen, ranch hands, bounty seekers, but this one made him freeze, hands still greasy from tuning the old windmill pump he'd dragged in from Waco. The snow outside had thickened, early for the season, and that sound, gentle, polite, unnatural for the harsh west, tapped like a bird that didn't belong here. He set his wrench down and stood up too fast, nearly kicking over the little pot of stew he'd coaxed from yesterday's salt pork bone. That pot was all he had left to show for 2 decades of grit, work, and mistakes he didn't want to think on anymore. When he opened the door, his first thought was that the woman must be lost, or perhaps sent by a mistake. Some wrong letter, some wrong man. She was too well postured, her cloak too neatly pinned, her face drawn and pale but careful, like someone taught not to complain even when her breath shook in the cold. She held a small, leather-tied bundle against her chest. Her boots were wrong, polished, Eastern. "Samuel Dory?" she asked, her voice low and practiced. "I am Delilah Graves, from the correspondence." He didn't answer right away. He remembered writing the letters, but barely. The ache of silence had gotten so loud after that fire took most of his family. He hadn't been sober for a stretch of months. Some cousin of a ranch hand had mentioned a newspaper in Kansas that printed up letters from frontier men seeking marriage relief. He thought he'd been joking when he wrote it, some half-drunken scribble about needing a hand and a heart, someone to cook, to speak, maybe to simply exist nearby so the wind wouldn't feel so sharp in his ribs. But here she stood. He stepped aside. "You best come in." She did, and in silence they both tried not to look too hard at the shack she now entered. The roof sagged at the back corner. The fireplace was choked with ash. A squirrel had found a hole in the rafters and left a trail of acorns like breadcrumbs across the shelf near the bed. He didn't apologize. She didn't flinch. She just walked to the hearth, knelt, and reached into her satchel. What happened next was the first of many things that would put every rancher in town into whisper mode within a month's time. From that satchel, she didn't pull a Bible or a letter from a reverend or some folded quilt from her mama's hands. She pulled a hammer, a chisel, and a small dented tin that smelled faintly of dried herbs and soot. "I need to see the floorboards," she said quietly. He blinked. "The what?" "The floorboards, the center, where the wind drafts coldest." He didn't move. She did. She cleared a space in the middle of the cabin, brushed aside his patched rug, and began tapping with the chisel, knocking 3 times, moving over, knocking again. She did this slowly, rhythmically. Her breath came in soft clouds. Samuel just stood there, mouth slightly open, watching a woman he'd never seen in his life start probing his home like she already knew something beneath it. "You don't have to. This is where it's coldest," she said softly. "The draft strongest. You feel it?" He didn't have to answer. That draft had cut through his boots since last winter. He'd never managed to fix it. She tapped once more, then set her tools aside. From her coat, she removed a small folded cloth, soot black on one side, deep crimson on the other, and laid it gently on the spot she'd marked. Then, taking the tin, she poured a black, grainy powder in a circle on the cloth, pressed her palm to it, and whispered something under her breath. He felt it first. The floor warmed, not suddenly, not like flame, but like the heat of a hand pressed against flesh too long cold. The air shifted. The bitter ache that always crept into his knees and ankles after sundown faded, and it was real heat from the ground. He fell to his knees beside her. "What is that?" She didn't look at him. Her eyes were still closed, palm pressed to the cloth, whispering again. Her lips moved like someone not praying, but remembering. When she opened her eyes, they were glassy, damp from some private place he couldn't reach. "It's a hearth," she said. "Not fire, not wood, something else." That night, Samuel Dory didn't sleep, not because he was afraid, but because the warmth from the floor was steady, gentle. It made the air no longer bite, and outside, the snow had started falling heavier. The next morning, Delilah was already awake, sitting by the hearthless hearth, sewing the cloth back into a bundle. "You said your name's Graves," he asked. "You from a family that does this?" "I had a husband once," she said simply. "He worked with things like this, until they killed him for it." That was all she said, and he knew better than to ask more. But he'd tell you later, if he ever told you anything at all, that in that moment 1,000 questions stormed into his mind, each heavier than the last. What kind of warmth came from no fire? Why did she need to be here, in this town, with this floor? And what would happen when the rest of the ranchers saw the smoke never rose from his chimney again? Because within days, they noticed, in the middle of the first cold snap, Samuel Dory's shack was the only place in town without smoke curling from a stovepipe. Yet folks began to say the frost never clung to his windows, and he never came into town coughing from the cold. And that's when the knocking began again. Not from her, from them. By the third morning, the frost hadn't so much as touched the inside of Samuel Dory's window glass. And that was unnatural, not in a way that made men cry magic or madness, but in the way of animals watching. Something strange from the tree line, cautious, curious, restless. Out in the hills east of town, the frost had snapped 24 saplings in half overnight. A coyote was found frozen stiff mid-step, and at the Allen Ranch, 3 pipes had burst, one scalding a hired hand too bad to ride for a week. But in Samuel's cabin, the wooden walls creaked softly, and the floor remained warm enough to walk barefoot, even before sunrise. And no fire was lit, no kindling stacked, no ashes cleared. Delilah had made no announcement of her method. No woman in town had seen her buy oil, cut logs, barter coal. And yet the warmth came each morning like clockwork, gentle and steady, seeping up from that invisible hearth she'd etched beneath the floorboards. But peace in the frontier don't last, especially not when it rubs against other men's suffering. The first visitor came on the 4th morning. Denton Clay, wide in the jaw and narrow in patience, rode up just after daybreak with a bottle of rye, and questions already pouring out of him. His own ranch was 5 miles west, perched up on rocky ground with no wind shelter, and his second boy had coughed blood from the cold just the night before. His boots were lined with rabbit fur. His coat was patched with squirrel hide. But the moment he stepped inside Samuel's shack, he stopped cold. "You got a fire lit?" he asked. "No," Samuel said, not even looking up from the tin plate of bread and beans he was eating. "It's warm in here." Delilah said nothing. She was off in the corner, sewing as she often did, her posture straight and eyes lowered like a woman who'd lived through too much to flinch at being examined. Denton walked slow toward the stove, then toward the hearth. No wood, no flame, nothing but a faint scent, earthy and strange, like dried moss and old smoke. He sniffed once, leaned down, touched the floor, and flinched. "It's warm," Samuel nodded. Denton stood back up, staring at the woman now. "You do this?" Delilah didn't answer, but her sewing hand never paused. "What is it?" Denton asked. "Some trick from back east? Pipes from a mine? Chemicals?" Samuel finally looked at him. "You ask a lot of questions for a man not offering much." Denton held up the rye bottle. "This is a gift, a neighbor's kindness. It's payment for information," Delilah said suddenly, her voice sharper than before. "Not warmth. You can keep it." Something in Denton's face twitched, offense, or maybe just confusion. Either way, he left without another word. But that was only the beginning. The next day, Widow Marlowe rode in with her eldest son, claiming her hens had frozen in their coop despite being locked in. She asked to borrow some salt, then lingered too long inside the cabin, her eyes scanning the ceiling, the walls, the floor. When she left, she didn't say thank you. 2 days later, Pastor Reeve himself knocked at dusk. He said he came to welcome the new bride, but he came alone, no Bible in hand, just an old pipe in his mouth and a folded kerchief in his coat pocket. He asked about Delilah's faith. She answered with a look that made Samuel grip his knee under the table. He asked about her upbringing. She said she'd been raised with enough truth to know that men seldom handle it well. And then he asked, too casually, about the warmth. Samuel didn't like the way the pastor said it, like it was something borrowed, like something owed. Delilah said nothing. She stood, walked to the hearth, and placed her hand gently to the floorboards. "It's clean," she said. "That's all it needs to be." The pastor left without blessing the house. By the end of the week, the town was restless. 6 men came by with excuses, broken fence lines, rumors of mountain lions, old debts they'd decided to collect. But what they really wanted was to see inside, to feel what wasn't right. Because by now they all knew. The chimney at Samuel's place didn't smoke. His woodpile stayed untouched. Yet his windows glowed with the faint warmth of lamplight long after theirs had gone black from the cold. One night, Samuel found tracks in the snow behind the cabin, boot prints, one set, coming up to the back wall, then circling to the front again. He didn't say anything to Delilah. He just cleaned his rifle and oiled the hinges on the door. But he noticed something the next morning, something he hadn't seen before. The little cloth she kept bundled in her satchel, the one she used that first night to mark the spot. It wasn't tucked away anymore. It had been sewn into the rug, right over the spot she'd warmed, not visible, but placed with intention. When he knelt to touch it, it was warm, not burning, not unnatural, just calm. That same afternoon, a storm rolled in fast. It came hard, whipping snow, shrieking wind, the kind that turned nails brittle and made animals go mad in their pens, the kind that cut off the pass east to Waco and trapped 3 stagecoaches in the ridge. Every man and woman in town hunkered down, stoking their fires, burning through coal and wood and dried dung to keep babies from dying in their cribs. But at Samuel's cabin, no fire was lit. Delilah stood by the floor, hand pressed to the cloth again, murmuring just loud enough to be heard over the gale outside. Samuel sat at the window and watched the snow climb past the first step. She looked pale, not sick, but thinner than before, her shoulders more drawn, like she was feeding something unseen, giving too much. He stood and approached her. "You all right?" She nodded, but didn't look up. "It draws from me," she said. "It always has." "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated. "It was my husband's. A legacy, a curse, a gift. I don't know which anymore." The words felt old in her mouth, as if she'd said them before to someone who hadn't listened. "I don't control it," she said. "I tend to it." That storm lasted 3 days, and when it cleared, something had changed. The snow had collapsed 2 roofs, 4 children had gone sick. The old mayor was found stiff in his outhouse, but Samuel's cabin stood untouched, windows unbroken, no smoke, no fire, no cold, and the town lost patience. Ranchers began sending word through their wives. Questions turned to demands. What was she doing in there? Why was she so quiet? What made the floor warm when every other house froze? And the one question that no one dared say out loud, but they all thought it. Was it unnatural? That's when Tom Birdle, a foreman from a neighboring claim, showed up drunk with a group of 5 other men and stood outside the cabin at dusk. He didn't knock. He shouted, "We don't want trouble, but we ain't gonna let some stranger come and hide miracles in plain sight while our kids freeze." Delilah didn't answer. Samuel did. He opened the door, rifle across his arm, and said nothing. The silence that followed was colder than the air. Eventually, Tom left, but not with his pride, and 2 nights later, the cloth was torn. Not entirely, just a small slit in one edge. Delilah found it first. Her hands trembled as she lifted the rug and saw the edge exposed. The warmth hadn't stopped, but it had faltered, thinned, like a heartbeat losing rhythm. She sat down hard on the floor, clutching the fabric, whispering again. Samuel watched from the corner. He didn't ask. He just locked the door and sat beside her, silent. He could feel it now, the thing beneath the floor, not alive, not dead, just present, and something was coming. Samuel had once thought he'd seen the worst of what men could do. War had made a cold circle in his memory. Half-lost brothers, fires lit behind retreating boots, the groan of dying horses in broken canyons. But there was a different kind of evil that grew in quiet towns like these, the kind that came not from lawless bloodshed but from silence too long held, from eyes squinting through frozen panes, from the whispering weight of envy that needed no law to justify itself. In the week after the cloth had been torn, the snow melted fast, unnaturally fast for that time of year. It wasn't spring yet, and the pass to Waco hadn't opened, but mud began to appear in places where it had no business being. Delilah slept less. Her skin paled. She didn't speak much, except when kneeling over that square patch sewn into the rug. Samuel offered food, even strong coffee with the last of the chicory root he'd saved from 2 winters ago, but she touched none of it. Instead, she kept watch over the floor like it was a grave and a cradle both. He wanted to ask her a dozen things. What was it truly? What cost had it taken from her? And what did it want in return? But some questions were better left to time. The heat still came, though thinner than before, like breath stretched too long. He could feel its unease, like something groaning quietly beneath the boards, too deep for sound, but close enough to trouble a man's teeth. And then, on the 7th night, someone tried to burn the cabin down. It wasn't a full effort, just oil thrown across the south wall, and a torch flung after it. But the snow was still too wet, the flame caught only briefly, and Samuel had been out back refilling the water barrel when he saw the light bloom. He stamped it out with his coat and rifle in hand, but he saw the tracks, 2 sets, running west. Boots, heavy ones. Delilah didn't scream, didn't shout. She stood in the center of the room, her hair unbound, her fingers dug into the stitched cloth like she was holding back a tide. The floor beneath her pulsed with heat, not visible, not violent, but felt like a fever underfoot. "You need to leave this place," she said, not turning toward him. "Now." "I'm not leaving," he said. She looked at him then, eyes wide and ringed with something older than fear. "You don't understand," she said. "They've touched it now. The cloth, the ground. Their violence breaks it open, and if it breaks open too far," she stopped herself, "it will take everything nearby. It's not just warmth, it's something older. It remembers what fire forgot." Samuel didn't understand, but he believed her. He knelt beside her. "Tell me what to do." She didn't answer, not directly. She took the chisel again, the one she had arrived with, and she began carving into the floor, not just a circle this time, a pattern, a spiral, intricate and angular, like a language made of wind and roots. "You're waking it?" he asked. "No," she whispered. "I'm asking it to choose." That night, No one slept, not even the town. Word had spread too fast. The Allen boys said the old preacher's cows had gone stiff, their blood frozen like glass inside their veins. Someone else swore their pond had boiled for half an hour. But every story led back to Samuel's cabin, and so the men gathered. Not all of them, just enough. 9 riders, 2 on foot, 4 rifles, and 1 man carrying a bucket of black sand used to smother coal fires. They came up the ridge at dawn, faces set, not with hate but with purpose, the kind of terrible, self-righteous purpose that makes men forget the weight of what they're doing. Samuel saw them from the window. He didn't warn Delilah. She was already standing, waiting. She held the cloth again, but now it looked different, darker at the edges, the crimson deeper, as though stained, not dyed. The tin of black powder was open at her feet. The spiral had been completed. "I can hold them off," Samuel said, loading the rifle. "No," she replied. "You can't. Not like that." She took his hand, cold, thin, trembling, and pressed it to the center of the spiral. "You're part of it now," she said. "You stepped inside when you let me stay, when you didn't ask me to explain." He felt the warmth climb up his fingers. Not heat, memory, her memories. A man beside her once, younger than Samuel, smiling as he carved the same patterns into an old church floor. A fire lit under strange stars. A baby held to her chest while soldiers pounded on the door, screaming, smoke, stones splitting like fruit in the heat. And then nothing, just silence and cold, until the warmth began again, in another cabin, with another man, and now here, she let go. "They've broken the spiral before," she said, "but not this one." The riders stopped 10 yards from the cabin. Denton Clay was among them, his jaw set like stone. Pastor Reeve held a torch, unlit for now, but ready. Tom Birdle stood with the bucket of black sand. Samuel opened the door. "What is it you want?" he asked, voice level. "You know what we want," Denton said. "You're hiding something. You got warmth without flame. That's not right." "And what is right?" Samuel asked. "Letting your children freeze while you burn your furniture for heat? Letting the sick die just so the air don't feel strange?" "We're not asking again," Tom said. "Let us in. We end it, quick and clean." Delilah stepped beside Samuel. "No," she said, and with one movement she dropped the cloth onto the spiral. The ground shook, not like an earthquake, more like the cabin took a breath. Deep, slow, pulling the world down into its lungs. The wood creaked. The floor glowed faintly, veins of red light threading through the spiral. Outside, the snow began to steam. Tom dropped the bucket. Pastor Reeve backed away, and then it burst. Not fire, not light, but warmth, a column of it, rising like breath through the seams of the earth. It wasn't visible to the eye, but it was felt in the marrow. The men staggered back, sweating in the snow, eyes wide, rifles dropping into mud. And then from the earth beneath the cabin came sound, a low, humming chord, like stone grinding against time, like all the stifled voices of warmth pushed beneath the crust of a cold world, now allowed to speak. Samuel fell to his knees. Delilah stood firm. She raised her hand and spoke in a voice not hers alone. "This hearth remembers. It does not forget the hands that tried to smother it. It remembers fire drowned in ice. It remembers blood poured into salt. It remembers hunger sharpened by men too proud to ask and too afraid to kneel." The riders fled, not as a group, one by one, stumbling through the steaming snow, faces pale, garments soaked with the sweat of shame. Only Pastor Reeve lingered a moment longer. He stared at Delilah and whispered, "What are you?" Delilah looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled. "I am a bride," she said, "to the warmth beneath, and now so is he." She turned to Samuel. He understood, not in words, not in any language that could be taught, but in the warmth that held him, that asked for nothing but presence, that forgave nothing, that waited only for someone to keep it. That night, no one else came. The town remained silent, and inside the cabin, the floor glowed gently. Delilah slept, finally, and Samuel watched the cloth rise and fall with the breath of something eternal. But beneath the floor, the spiral had deepened, and from its center, the warmth was growing still. The days after the spiral flared passed in a kind of suspended hush, like a town holding its breath without knowing why. Snow still lay in drifts along the ridge and between the cottonwoods, but it didn't bite anymore, not the way it had. Even 10, 15 feet from the cabin's edge, the air clung warmer than it should. The chickens in Samuel's coop began laying again, days before they had any right to. A rabbit sat in the front yard one morning, not moving, just soaking in the warmth, until a crow overhead called, and it startled off with no urgency in its feet. And yet no one came to Samuel's cabin, not to visit, not to snoop, not to knock. They stayed away. The same ranchers who once circled like buzzards now rode wide around the hill, even when it meant extra hours in the saddle. At night, one could see their distant lamplights flicker beyond the ridgeline. But no one came near, not even Pastor Reeve. Something had changed. The warmth that once seemed like a mystery now carried a cost. Not a deadly one, not yet, but the memory of that morning, when the ground had pulsed and the air had sung through every wooden slat, still hung over the town like an unfinished chord. Delilah barely left the rug. She slept little, her body curled near the spiral, as if she were guarding it with bone and breath alone. Samuel offered food, water, warmth, but none of it reached her. She would speak only in fragments now, whispers about weight and balance, about keeping it calm and centered. Her skin grew almost translucent, the blue in her veins more vivid by the day. Samuel tried to help. He cleaned the cabin like a man trying to distract himself from drowning. He chopped the logs he no longer needed. He brushed snow from a roof that refused to sag. He whittled a new door latch from pine just to keep his hands moving, but always, when he stopped, his ears turned toward the floor, and always he felt it. Not a hum, not a beat, but a presence, something waiting, watching, breathing. Then one morning the warmth vanished. Not entirely, but enough. The cabin was cold again, not bitter, but no longer the steady heat that had pulsed through the boards like a heartbeat. Delilah didn't move. Her lips were pale, her breathing thin. Samuel knelt beside her. "What happened?" he whispered. Her voice came like wind under a door. "It's listening." "To what?" "To them." She turned her head, just slightly, toward the west-facing window, toward town. Samuel stood, crossed to the window, and stared. In the distance, a line of men had gathered by the edge of town. Not close, not yet, but visible. 11 of them. No horses. One held a spade, one held a torch, one held a folded white cloth. Samuel didn't know what they meant to do, but Delilah did. "They want to bury it," she said, "to press it down. Not kill it, they can't, but to silence it again." "You said it remembers," he said. "Does it forget?" She shook her head. "No, it only waits. For a keeper, or for a grave." He sat beside her. "I won't let them touch it. You can't stop them all. I don't have to. I just need to keep it calm." She looked at him then, really looked, the way someone looks at an oath they wish hadn't been made. "You've already given it part of you," she said. "More than I thought." "What does that mean?" She hesitated. "The hearth answers to presence, not belief, not blood. It opens to those who make space for it. You did, without knowing. And now, it knows you." That night the warmth returned, but it was different, sharper, hungrier. The spiral glowed faintly again, but instead of red, it burned a deep gold, like dusk filtered through smoke. The floorboards trembled once in the dark, a breath so subtle it felt like the house settling. But it wasn't the house. Samuel slept by the spiral, Delilah beside him. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. Her fingers twitched in her sleep, like someone holding threads that stretched miles beyond the room. At dawn, the door creaked open, not from force, but invitation. Samuel woke to the cold. The warmth had retreated into the spiral, coiled tight like a fist. The cloth had shifted, a corner torn again. Delilah was gone. He found her tracks in the snow, barefoot, leading west, toward town. He followed without coat or rifle, his breath slicing the air in sharp bursts. The town was quiet, too quiet for morning. Then he saw them, the men, the same ones, standing in a circle behind the old church. The ground dug open in the center, like a shallow grave. Delilah stood at the edge, her hair wild, her eyes closed. They meant to bury the cloth. The torch flickered in Tom's hand. The spade rested against Denton's boot, and Pastor Reeve held the folded cloth in both hands, arms stretched like a man holding a holy thing he didn't believe in. Samuel stepped forward. Delilah opened her eyes. "Too late," she whispered, and the ground opened, not wide, not violent, just enough, a single breath from the earth, like the spiral had reached across the miles and drawn its keeper back. Delilah's knees buckled. Her body dropped to the ground like a petal, slow and soft. But the cloth in Reeve's hands curled at the corners, smoked, cracked. He dropped it, and the warmth came, from the wound in the soil, from the grave they'd meant to fill. But it didn't come as heat. It came as memory. Every man there saw it. Their worst nights, their coldest regrets, the babies they couldn't save, the wives they let freeze, the mothers they buried too soon. And then Delilah's voice, not spoken, felt. "You chose cold because it asked less of you. You feared warmth because it required you to stay." Samuel stepped into the circle. The men didn't stop him. He lifted her in his arms. She was barely breathing. "I need the spiral," she whispered. He carried her back, past the stunned men, past the broken cloth, back to the cabin. He laid her on the rug. The spiral was still faintly lit. She pressed her hand to it. "I can seal it," she said, "for a time, but not forever." "Why?" "Because warmth doesn't die. It only waits for someone to remember. He covered her with blankets, watched as her breath slowed, and finally she slept. The town didn't speak of it, not openly. They said the frost lifted early that year. They said Samuel kept to himself after the girl vanished. They said the cabin on the ridge never smoked again, but no one ever went up there. And when a new settler tried to build a house too close, his roof collapsed in midsummer. They moved the town border a mile back and left the warmth to keep its silence. But sometimes, on windless nights, you could still see a faint glow through the floorboards, and if you stepped close enough, you'd feel it. Not fire, not heat, but presence. And if you listened, truly listened, you'd hear her, still whispering, still watching, still keeping the hearth no man could kill. The cabin held its breath. That's what it felt like in the days that followed Delilah's collapse, as if the boards, the dust, the walls themselves were bracing, listening, not to Samuel, not to the wind, but to her, to the spiral. The warmth still came, but now it came slowly, hesitantly, as if testing the edges of itself. Samuel never left her side. She lay where he had placed her, bundled in blankets he had stitched with trembling fingers, her hand still curled toward the spiral like a vine trying to reach sun through stone. Sometimes she murmured, names, places, things he couldn't make sense of. Sometimes her eyes flickered open, only to close again before they focused on him. Outside, spring had not yet come, but the frost was broken. In town, people began to speak in whispers again, not about the miracle, but the price. They said Delilah had vanished. Some said Samuel had buried her beneath the floor. Others said she had turned to ash and scattered herself into the wind. Only a few claimed to have seen her walking alone through town that dawn before the circle opened, barefoot, hair loose, eyes half lit with something not of this world. None dared ask Samuel directly. None came close to the cabin, but they watched. Always, he could feel it. Their fear, their shame, their silent longing. Not one of them would admit what had nearly happened, but each of them now slept with one extra log on the fire, just in case. Each of them now walked wider around their own hearths, uncertain what warmth truly was anymore. And Delilah lingered in that half state, not dead, not gone, not present. One morning, Samuel noticed her fingers twitch in rhythm, not shaking, not random, but deliberate, like she was stitching a pattern into air. He leaned close. "What is it?" he whispered. Her eyes opened then, fully, and this time she saw him. "It's moving again," she said. "What is?" "The hearth." He looked down. The spiral had changed, not in shape. It was still the same pattern, same etched lines, but it pulsed differently now, less like a wound, more like a heartbeat, steady, assured. "You've kept it," she said. He nodded. "I didn't know how, I just stayed. That's all it ever wanted," she murmured. She reached for his hand, her palm pale and cool. "I can't keep it anymore. It's too much. I was meant to pass it on. I just didn't know to who." Samuel felt the weight of her fingers, felt the warmth climb into his wrist. "It remembers you now," she whispered. "It trusts you." "I'm no priest," he said quietly, "no guardian. I've killed men. I've abandoned things that mattered. I let this whole town rot for years while I drank myself into forgetting." Delilah smiled weakly. "That's exactly why it chose you. You stayed. When others ran. When it was easier to forget. You listened, and you didn't demand." The spiral brightened. A faint golden hue shimmered beneath the boards, and the warmth returned. Not heavy, not hungry, but calm, balanced. Delilah took one final breath, long and slow, and then she closed her eyes. Not in death, in sleep. Deep, lasting, unburdened sleep. Samuel wept quietly. He moved her to the bed, tucked the blankets around her, and sat back by the hearth. He didn't touch the spiral. He didn't chant. He didn't draw symbols or speak words. He just sat, and it responded. The years passed. The town changed. Children grew. Men died. Homes were built, torn down, built again. New names arrived on the registry. New families moved through the ridge, some staying, most not. But no one touched the cabin, even when a new preacher arrived, younger and louder than Reeve had ever been, with fire in his voice and condemnation in his sermons. No one asked him to climb the ridge. No one dared, because sometimes, when the wind hit just right, warmth would drift into town, not like a breeze, not like a storm, but like a breath, slow, steady, kind. And though the townsfolk never spoke of it, they welcomed it. They'd pause in their steps, let their shoulders relax, watch the frost melt just a little faster from their porch rails. No one knew what Samuel did inside that cabin. No one asked, but he stayed, through 6 winters, through the death of his dog, through the slow fade of Delilah's sleep into silence. He buried her beneath the cottonwood tree. No marker, just a spiral, carved into the trunk. He didn't speak at her burial, just sat by the grave until the sun went down, and then returned to the hearth. One spring, a child arrived, not from town, not from anywhere nearby. She just appeared, ragged dress, straw-colored hair, eyes too wide and too still. Samuel found her sitting on the porch, legs tucked beneath her, hands cupped around a cracked teacup that hadn't been used in years. She looked at him and said nothing. He looked back. "You hungry?" She nodded. He cooked what he had: beans, dried apples, a little pork fat left from the winter kill. She ate, slept by the hearth, stayed, never spoke a name, never asked a question. But when she found Delilah's chisel in the drawer, she took it, sat by the rug, and began to trace the spiral. Samuel didn't stop her. He just watched, and the warmth responded. Years passed again, and the town became a place of many hearths. Fewer chimneys smoked, fewer homes burned. Children grew up with warmth that didn't blister. Old men died with peace instead of frostbite. No one spoke of the cabin, but they all knew. The mail-order bride who came from nowhere. The warmth that asked for nothing but presence. The man who stayed when he had every reason to leave. And the spiral, unseen, untouched, but felt, like a breath below the floorboards. A kindness beneath the weight of cold. Still pulsing, still listening, still waiting, and for those who stayed, it would always be there.